So, in preparation for episode 8 of Eco Echoes, Sheldon had the brilliant idea of sharing a journal article with me in our little document that we share together before this. I don't know if he expected me to read a journal article
I think it was
like climate policy.
It was, yeah, I find that interesting.
Okay, good to know. So I think from now on, I'm not going to click on any links that you send me. If there's anything important, just let me know. I did read one paragraph.
Very strong reaction.
Okay, fair enough. I read one paragraph of a journal article related to climate. That's all I know about the topic we're going to jump into today, which is all about BC.
Yes.
And so, I've lived in BC now for almost 10 years, BC being British Columbia for any of our non-Canadian listeners, few of you. I've lived in BC for 10 years, absolutely love it here. Today's topic is really all about, learning about BC's role in climate policy when it comes to Canada. My, general understanding is we're fairly progressive, and I'm kind of keen to, hear from you what your thoughts are. I don't really know much about the topic, obviously, but I really keen to hear your thoughts are about this. But before we get started, also, since we're doing another video episode, we wanted to try something else, which is I kind of asked Sheldon to bring something that for him represents British Columbia.
It's true.
So Sheldon, what did you bring that represents BC?
Just right here.
What is that?
Just a little puppet. Just a little orca puppet. His name is Gerard.
Okay. Why does Gerard represent BC for you?
So orcas, I think, are, well, when I'm not from British Columbia, or I didn't grow up in British Columbia, and one of the emblems or symbols of British Columbia certainly was, for me, or has been, the orca, because there are large populations of different populations of orcas in and around British Columbia and further south into Washington. I was in and around the Lower Mainland, and then further down into Washington, and then they also go all the way up to Alaska, and so it's and I think they're quite representative of the nature that is endemic to British Columbia. So
awesome, lovely. Yeah. We just had to work orcas into the podcast somehow.
100%.
So appreciate that
every single time.
All right, so just to jump into our first question, and maybe keeping this one pretty broad, is British Columbia a leader or behind the pack when it comes to climate policy?
Yes. So, is British Columbia a leader in terms of implementing policy? Yes. Okay. I don't really think there's much controversy behind that. Is British Columbia a leader in terms of successful policy? Okay. Is a much more complex question. Okay. Because there is a long history of climate-related policy in British Columbia, and frankly, it is hard to point to anything in particular as super successful, with a few exceptions. Okay. But broadly, the suite of climate policies that exist in this province, I think at the very least in North America, it's absolutely the most progressive kind of jurisdiction from what policies exist, even innovation in policy to an extent. The only potential competitor in terms of leading the pack might be California. California and British Columbia are actually, to a degree, neck and neck when it comes to implementing policy. And that's North America. Europe's its own beast, but that's very different because of the EU and that whole framework that exists.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Good to know. So I think we've touched on before, the California, BC relationship in a sense as well. So that's cool to hear. So I guess why? So you kind of give me the general answer, which is totally fair. I get that. But why is BC considered to be a leader? Can you expand a bit more on that? What have we actually done that's that has a leadership, gives us that leadership position, let's say? Right.
So there are, I think, two particular aspects to this. So the first one is, and we've talked about at length, carbon tax.
Okay, yeah.
Right?
Sounds familiar.
Yes. Carbon tax is implemented in a few different ways across Canada. It has been since 2019 because of federal legislation. British Columbia was the first jurisdiction in North America to bring in a carbon tax, and that was long before the carbon tax had been talked about at a federal level. British Columbia brought in their carbon tax in 2008. And one of the interesting aspects of this is British Columbia's government at the time was a relatively right-leaning from a political spectrum perspective, government, and that was the government that brought in the carbon tax. It was not a left of center or a left government from a political spectrum perspective. And that is unique because today, to an extent, at least south of the border, climate action is perceived to be something that is for the left side and something that is not for the right side. Very broad brush that I'm aware that I'm painting here.
Yeah.
But that's in general what that what the feeling is. Yeah. But the fact is that it is a government that is right of center, that was the first government to bring in a carbon tax and that was in British Columbia. Yeah.
And so in 2008, you said, so it was the first jurisdiction in all of North America to do this, or just in Canada?
In all of North America.
Oh, cool. Okay, so that in a sense, that is like at least leadership when it comes to the carbon tax, I guess.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that's one. That was the first one.
Yeah.
The second one, and this is kind of to my earlier point around neck and neck with California, British Columbia adopted what's called a low carbon fuel standard. And I think the legislation was 2007 or 2008 for British Columbia. It was 2006 or 2007 for California. So they were somewhat were created around the same time. The intent of the low carbon fuel standard is to decrease the emissions profile of the of the transportation sector as a whole. And but that was implemented in British Columbia again, like around that same time. And it still stands today. In fact, it is often used as an example of one of the more successful policy instruments, certainly in North America when it comes to climate. It has actually successfully achieved its targets.
So that's one where like they not only innovated on the policy, which you're saying there's a bunch of that, but then it's actually maybe measurably successful as well.
Yeah.
Which is maybe less or more rare.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. Okay, so there's something measurable out of all this stuff we talk about. It's not just mumbo jumbo.
No.
Okay.
No.
Good to know.
This is not all just mumbo jumbo.
I don't know. I'm learning.
But to your point about mumbo jumbo, this is interesting.
Yeah,
in terms of that California-British Columbia relationship, apparently one of the reasons that British Columbia may have been more progressive around that period of time is because Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor of California around 2006, 2007, and was pushing or trying to implement environmental and climate-friendly legislation in California. And apparently he had a number of one-on-one conversations with the premier of British Columbia at the time.
Interesting.
So when you think about it, it is entirely possible that there is at least part of British Columbia's policy ecosystem, let's call it, that exists because of Arnold Schwarzenegger.
That's pretty impressive. We are influenced by him.
Yeah, this was long after the Terminator movies. So,
yeah, okay.
Yeah, Rise of the Machines was like 2003.
Fair enough.
And we're talking 3 years after that. And Rise of the Machines is not peak Terminator.
Fair enough. Okay,
yeah,
so
92 is
our policy
is
influenced by celebrity, I guess, as we can say.
I wouldn't say that.
Okay, not at all. Okay,
no, I don't want to say that.
Fair enough. Awesome. So you've kind of in that answer you touched on policy, and maybe a little bit about how like maybe some of those comparisons to California specifically. I'm curious to hear about the comparison maybe to the rest of Canada. So obviously you talk a lot about the federal stuff, but maybe even just other provinces. In what way do we either again stand out or compete or differentiate from other provinces and or the federal government when it comes to climate policy?
Right. So up until 2015, which is when the Trudeau government came to power federally, climate action across the country was kind of a patchwork. I think we've talked about this before briefly.
Remind me. Quickly.
Yeah, sure. But there was policy that existed in British Columbia, in Alberta, and in Quebec, and to an extent in Ontario as well. Those were the main. There were like a few others, but it was that landscape looked sparse. And so, to your question, in terms of what how things have looked for British Columbia relative to the federal government and the federal level, I think. And it's 100% true, when the federal government was in the midst of creating the climate plan that encompasses carbon tax applied across the country, one of the examples that they pointed to as as successful was British Columbia's carbon tax. So that's just an example of where British Columbia has extended its reach and had an influence across the country. The low carbon fuel standard too. Federally, Canada has this regulation called the Clean Fuel Regulation, and it is to an extent analogous to the low carbon fuel standard in British Columbia.
Okay.
So it targets transportation fuels. And that too was also used, or when it was being designed and developed, one of the successful policies that was pointed to was the low carbon fuel standard in British Columbia and in California, to be fair. Yeah.
Very interesting. Again, I don't know if you know this or if you have any examples off the top of your head. Is there anything that, like, from other provinces that's like maybe any top programs that maybe were implemented at the federal level that come from Ontario that have influenced us in reverse, I guess? I'm just curious if anything comes to mind.
Yes. So I don't necessarily think so for Ontario specifically, but the other good example for provincial that went federal is Alberta's industrial carbon pricing system. Because Alberta's industrial carbon pricing system has been quite successful, and it is in its design is more or less what has been used as the model for industrial carbon pricing systems across Canada, including the federal industrial carbon pricing system.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's like we're innovative. There's other innovation that happens elsewhere when it comes to climate policy, but we're kind of saying, BC has a pretty special place in that world.
Yeah, I think I think of British Columbia as an early adopter of climate action.
I like that. That's a good soundbite. I like it.
Yes.
Awesome. And so, how maybe again in reverse how has the federal action or federal decisions affected the BC climate policy? So we've talked about kind of how BC has impacted federal, other provinces have impacted federal, but how has federal impacted BC climate policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one was when carbon pricing was implemented across the country, right? So yes, British Columbia already had a carbon tax in place, but one of the things that came out of the federal government was the rise in the carbon price across the country, right, to 2030. And I think we did touch on this, but it was a rise in $10 increments for the first few years and then $15 increments over the next few years. So today, the carbon price across Canada, at least that the consumer pays, is $80 a ton. And that is because of federal legislation. So when the carbon tax was first adopted in British Columbia, they set it at $10 a ton, and then they were going to raise it by to $20 a ton and then to $30 a ton. And then there was no visibility beyond what that looked like. The province just didn't really make a commitment to increase it and do anything more than that from the carbon tax perspective. So when the federal government came into place in 2015, and then they adopted this ambitious climate agenda, they put together that ramp up of the carbon price. So the fact is that today, British Columbians pay the $80 a ton carbon tax. The reason that the carbon tax exists is because of British Columbia, but the reason that it's $80 is because of the federal government.
Okay, I see. So almost influencing more on the specifics of the implementation, let's say, it comes from the federal government, which makes sense, I guess.
I think I may be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but one of the other interesting things, and it's quite, there's has been a lot of discussion about it, is a cap on oil and gas related emissions. Okay. So this again, it can be or might be federal action driving provincial action. Okay. Because while there are a few provinces who have really pushed back and said, absolutely not, we're in no way, shape, or form ever going to accept anything like this, British Columbia, and because this came out of the federal government, right? The federal government said we're going to cap emissions on oil and gas in addition to carbon pricing, in addition to clean fuel regulation. So it's all, in a sense, supposed to be complementary. Yeah. When the federal government suggested that, the British Columbia government said, nope, we have no interest in being capped by the federal government because British Columbia is going to put in one themselves. Okay, so that's a case where the province said, we're going to
use our own. We're gonna we agree on like the vision, let's say.
Yeah, exactly.
But we're gonna follow our own like program or policy.
Yeah.
And then was that a case where like they wanted to be more aggressive with their targets, or like like kind of have more control over it? Like, what do you know? I guess.
So yet to be determined, because that's the oil and gas cap, both at the federal level and at the provincial level, still very much in the design discussion phases. So it's yet to be determined what the stringency of British Columbia's system might look like relative to what the stringency of the federal government system might look like. Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to kind of understand, in a sense, like a bit more about like why they made that decision. I guess it'd be kind of cool to see. And is it just because they want to be more ambitious, or again like just have more control? I
mean, I'd consider that because of the narrative of British Columbia as a climate leader, it's almost useful to them, right, to keep working through that narrative. So federal government comes along and says, hey, we're going to implement this oil and gas cap. And then British Columbia, climate leader that it is, says, okay, that's great, but we don't want the federal government to intervene in this. We're going to do it ourselves. And that shows kind of, in a sense, to external parties, I would think, probably, shows continues to show British Columbia as a climate action leader.
Yeah, so like more autonomy, but also like more leadership position in that space. Okay, cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so thinking about that, so you touched on the low carbon fuel standard as like a successful example of something that BC has implemented that has maybe had successful outcomes. Are there other programs like that or climate action like that that BC has done that you could also point to as success stories? I mean, it sounds like, we do a lot, but, tell me more of these success stories, if they exist, I guess.
I think it's important to contextualize that climate action success you look at over a long-term period of time, right? Like we're talking about 2006, 2007, 2008, right, as the origins of some of the climate action, the first climate action in North America. That is really not that long ago, right? 2006 was 18 years ago. Yeah. So not in kind of like, from a long-term perspective, not that long. And at the same time, one of the other successful, I think, items that British Columbia achieved was, and I've heard some, I don't know the full context here, to be fair, some controversy around this piece of legislation called the Clean Energy Act that was put into effect in 2010. But one of the things that it did is said British Columbia's electricity is 90% clean or more kind of thing. And it kind of put that into legislation, which meant that whenever there was somebody who came along who wanted to add to the electricity supply in British Columbia, they needed to ensure that the province would still be able to meet that 90%. So let's say it's the province starts at 90%, and then you have a coal-fired plant investor that comes along and says, hey, we want to set up a coal-fired electricity station here in the province. And the province would likely say no, because that's going to decrease that 90%, right? So it kind of acted as a clean electricity standard in a way. And what I found out is that as soon as that was announced, the Clean Energy Act was announced, and that I think it was that 90% number, there were three contracts that were immediately ripped up. Two were for proposed coal-fired electricity plants. One was for a natural gas-fired electricity plant. And so, in a sense, that like it's hard to justify what would have happened, right? But it is very likely that British Columbia's electricity supply would look a lot different than it is today if it hadn't been for that policy.
Okay, that's like interesting to see how policy influences the decisions. Obviously, like in a case like this, from like a business standpoint, maybe it's obviously bad because you have these investors that want to invest in the province that no longer can. But then obviously from a climate standpoint, it's for the good because we're limiting our carbon emissions as a province.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's like interesting to look at it that way. And I think one thing you just pointed out that I thought was interesting is how like a lot of this stuff originated 16 years ago. looking 16 years into the future, we'd be at 2040. And I think that the kind of interesting thing is we see a lot of policy around like the 2030s, and then I think there's some like bigger organizations that aim to do stuff for the 2050s.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, like, as you were talking, I was like, oh, I wonder what the world's going to look like in 16 years from now. and would we be saying that, like so much has changed, or what the success of these policies will be? I know we don't have a crystal ball, but any just quick thoughts on that?
I think the word you're looking for is prognostications.
Okay. Yeah.
You raise an interesting point, so there's an idea of what everyone in the kind of climate world thinks that's going to look like, right? Light duty vehicles, all electrified. We're going to have, let's say we have hydrogen adopted for heavy duty vehicles. We have like these big freighters that run on like methanol and other kind of fuels. We have sustainable aviation fuels. Like that's kind of in a sense what a lot of people anticipate the world to look like. What I find both daunting and really, really exciting at the same time is that we have absolutely no idea what the world's going to look like in 16 years. And there's two precedent kind of things that I like to turn back to say, like, we could have a dramatic change in things that we have just no idea are coming. Yeah. And the first one was like the early 90s, or even before the early 90s, which is the invention of the internet. Right? Nobody had any idea that the internet was coming, and it completely changed everything. It changed communications. Like, and communications crosses so many different things, right? So that's one. And then the other one I like to point to is the iPhone, right? In 2007, Steve Jobs walked out onto a stage, and now, like, you have upwards of 1 billion people who have that type of phone in their hands, right? And that was around that same time, right? So we don't know what's going to happen, but what we do know is that it's going to be likely quite different from what it is today.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of cool way to think about it, especially I think with climate as an industry growing so rapidly and like receiving more investment and more attention, that like the likelihood of these like maybe successful innovations that aren't even on maybe the average person's radar today to become like a critical part of our energy supply or how we do things in the future. So I think that's like it's a very interesting but obviously optimistic way to look at it. Hopefully that's all we have, I guess, is some optimism and action for sure. But
hold up. But the optimism is one thing, but I think like and drawing back down to the ground, right? From at least from a resources perspective, and understanding that so much of resources plays into this in terms of where we get our energy and or where we get our energy, period. And some of that also relies on mining. And it's important to note that the lead time required to get any types of these projects like developed, whether it's Canada, whether it's elsewhere, yes, it does matter, but it's a long period of time anyways, right? And so that's why to your earlier point about the 2030 as a kind of like a touch point is very like it's so soon, like it's ridiculously soon. From an investment standpoint, that's ridiculously soon. From a large project perspective, that's ridiculously soon. Even 2040 is soon, right? Because when we talk about these sizable projects, like we're talking about like 20, 30 plus 40 plus years in terms of lifetime of project. So that's the daunting part, right? Is like, where do we put our money, our limited supply of money into climate action such that we can scale it up in order to meet the objectives and the targets that we have agreed to avoid the worst effects of climate change and whatever, in a timely fashion.
Fair enough. Yeah, that makes sense. I think I get it. I think I get it.
Do you?
I think I do. No, I like it. I think it's a good perspective into the future. Yeah, Gerard gets it. He needs this to happen because otherwise he's going to die, I think.
Okay, we're not going to
get there. Okay. No, so as usual, when we kind of get closer to wrapping up, the two main things we talk about is, a lot of the topics relations to businesses and individuals. And so I guess my thought on, at least on this topic, is like, how have businesses in BC adapted to the climate policies that the province has put forth, given that they're usually like maybe experimental or innovative? How have businesses adapted to all of this over time?
In a sense,
thoughts?
In a sense, they've just accepted them. And I think that's important because climate action type policies have not been that controversial in British Columbia, right? And that's why businesses have just had to adopt them. I wouldn't say necessarily that businesses have been like, yes, 100%, throw another climate policy at me. I am ready. I'm just into it. I don't think that's the case. But I do think that in general, the population accepts that there is a lot of action that needs to take place. And some of that action is going, like the onus of that action is going to need to be borne by businesses. So I do personally, I think that we're getting to a point where businesses are going to say no,
that's enough.
Yeah, that's enough. But it's hard to say that.
Interesting. Yeah, okay, I guess it's interesting to think about like some of the things, at least we'll talk about the consumer stuff next, but like as a consumer, we've had the plastic bag.
That was federal.
Federal. There you go. Learning something new, like I don't know, like paper straws, all this stuff. That's maybe business and consumer touching probably very, not really related to the big picture climate. But just interesting, like to think about how some of that stuff kind of works its way into like into society or the pop culture of society. And true. Kind of the day-to-day of what we do, because I don't like paper straws, but it's all good. So let's continue and talk about tying it back to the individuals. What do these, again, progressive climate policies that BC implements, how do they impact maybe households? Let's not just say necessarily individuals, like a household. What are maybe some of the benefits or challenges that have faced these households as well?
So I think the answer to that depends on where you live, because some people lead a higher carbon lifestyle than others. Some people do that by choice. I'm thinking of, people who live in the Lower Mainland or Vancouver who are driving Hummers around. We saw one recently, right?
It's true.
That's right.
It's impressive. It was a Hummer, I believe, that had like literally three rows, but like doors for each row. So this Hummer had 6 doors. It was wild.
That is a heavy vehicle. It requires a lot of gasoline.
Definitely.
To run. So, but that is obviously like a choice that somebody's made, right? As opposed to somebody who's like out living in, let's say, in Fort St. John or Fort Nelson or Prince George, where because of the conditions that are out there, because they don't have the same infrastructure that they have in larger cities or the metro region or Metro Vancouver region, there's less choice for them to make the types of decisions to like buy an EV or those kinds of things, right? So in that sense, I think the impact to consumers, I think we're seeing more action and changes in daily lives, more so in urban centers rather than in rural areas, right? I think that's like there is a balance there, and there's some that we would see. I mean, the bottom line is effectively everybody has seen higher gas prices, and that is effectively supposed to be the case with a carbon tax if the carbon tax is not revenue neutral, which originally the carbon tax here in British Columbia was revenue neutral, and then they stopped that between different governments. So that's one. Things are more expensive because of climate action, and I think that's almost kind of like par for the course. It's like, the status quo doesn't work anymore, so we need to change what the status quo is. It's like, okay, let's change what the status quo is. Do you have to pay anything for it? Yes, 100%. If you're going to change something, you do have to pay for it. And I wish there was another way around it, but that is kind of the reality.
But I think, a lot of this ties back to like this concept we talked about a lot, which is like, behavioral change. A lot of the consumer stuff ties back to that, right? Like what policies often do is they're trying to nudge consumers to change their behavior around something. And that could be done by, maybe making the process do something difficult or more easy, and or, charging more or less money for it. So from my perspective, the things that come to mind are like the EV incentives. So obviously there's the federal one, but there is a provincial one as well. That's kind of a top up to encourage people. It's like, hey, it's easier to switch to EVs. I know we talk about EVs a lot on this podcast for some reason. And then the other one, I guess, the ones I see and not really relevant to me, but like the home buyer, not the home buyers, but like the people who are doing renovations for their homes.
Oh, like retrofits.
Like retrofits for windows, heat pumps, I believe as well. There's a lot of credits as well that happen. And so from my perspective, it's like, oh, in this way you can like continue to live the same quality of life in your home, but hey, we're going to help you fund your heat pump or your new windows. So that's the stuff that comes to mind for me. I mean, I don't know if this is like capital C climate policy, but like I think it's just interesting that that's as an individual what I see.
No,
at least
it
in the
all
news.
applies.
And,
Like, it certainly all applies. But
Yeah.
I think it's important to consider that, like, those incentives, they're coming from some kind of government funding,
Yeah, yeah.
right? For the vast majority
Yeah,
of
yeah,
them. And so effectively, they are costs that are borne by the taxpayer.
Someone is
right?
fair enough.
But I think the pushback against climate action is far less here in British Columbia than it is elsewhere.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
Good to
Yeah.
know. Awesome. Go.
yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add?
Well, no, the other thing I was going to mention too, and I don't know that it is true anymore, but again, when the carbon tax was more revenue neutral, residents would receive checks in the mail for the carbon tax rebate, and that existed in British Columbia before it existed at the federal level. And so that's just another one of the
Example.
the examples of impacts to consumers.
Awesome. Yeah, so we talked, I mean, just to wrap this up entirely, we talked about kind of 2040, the 16-year horizon a little bit, but I guess maybe, I don't know if it's even in the shorter term or the longer term, but like, what do you see as, let's call it, on the horizon for British Columbia? Are there any like either current, new upcoming initiatives that you're like, oh, like I'm going to keep my eyes on that, and it's exciting for you to look into?
I think the only one that I'm really paying a lot of attention to and seeing where it goes is that oil and gas cap that I mentioned. If it is implemented, what kind of stringency it's going to have. Because I don't know a good example elsewhere in the world where that kind of policy has been adopted. So if it's adopted in British Columbia, if it's deemed to be successful for whatever different reasons, then it stands to reason that in the future, then it could be adopted in like many other jurisdictions, including jurisdictions outside of Canada. So that's kind of the one thing that I'm paying a lot of attention to. But to broadly more answer your question, like, there's an election coming up in British Columbia in the fall. And so, climate action may be on the agenda. I know it is for two of the main political parties in British Columbia. For whatever reason, I don't know. This is like the names provincially. I don't know I can't remember if we've talked about this. The names provincially do not line up with the names federally. At least that was the case for a long time, right? So in British Columbia, you had the BC Liberals, who are more or less right of center. And then you had the NDP, who were more or less left of center. And then you had kind of like a couple of other parties, one being the Green Party, which had a few MLAs or members of the Legislative Assembly. And then you had, I think the Conservative Party has existed for a long time, just had very, very small representation. Whereas, but the BC Liberals are not equivalent to the federal Liberals. The BC Liberals are more easily equivocated to the federal Conservatives. And like recently, over the last year or so, the BC Liberals then rebranded to BC United.
Okay.
That is their political party. But the reason I bring all of this up is BC United and the NDP are more or less aligned on climate action. The party that's gained the most in terms of momentum over the past few months is the BC Conservatives, who are like, let's call it 50-50 on climate action. So the BC Conservatives are now more in line with the rhetoric, at least, that's been spouted by a few people at the federal level for the Conservative Party. So all of this is to say that with the election kind of coming up, I think it's unlikely for climate action to be a big kind of component of it. But it may be. Okay. It's hard to say. So then just going back to your original question, what's to come is really contingent on what that election looks like.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I know very little on the politics side, but again, I think the thing I've learned from our conversations is that like I shouldn't be as ignorant about that stuff as much, especially when it comes to climate, because ultimately a lot of the climate decisions and policy happens because of these people that we elect to government, kind of akin to the vote with your vote concept we've talked about before. And so
Yeah, exactly.
I think I need to educate myself a little bit as we get into the election season this time, because I'm not very well educated on that topic, and I think it brings a lot of flavor into the climate chats we've been having.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, awesome, Sheldon. Thank you for your time. Glad we got to talk about BC.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gerard, the Orca. We've got Gerard the Orca with us today as well. Yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, have a great rest of your day.
We'll be on our way.
Cheers.